Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy, an Agora Podcast Network member. We are on Facebook and Twitter, and if you have any questions, comments, feedback, show ideas, you can always send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by Professor James Early to discuss how Christianity was reintroduced to the British Isles after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. Or we could, to be more precise, we could say how Christianity was introduced to the Anglo Saxons, or maybe how it spread amongst other Germanic aristocracies. It's a complicated situation. In this time period, during the Middle Ages, if you will, many different groups of people from outside of the traditional borders of the Roman Empire were exposed to Roman Mediterranean culture and Roman Latin Western-based Christianity. We're going to look at many groups or tribes and see how they integrated and adopted Western Latin Christianity and what effects these groups had on Christianity. Now, if you listen to Beyond the Big Screen, you will know Professor Early. He's a fascinating guy with the wide historical interests and knowledge. I hope to have him on many more times. He is also the moderator of the Great American History Fanatics Facebook group and blog. You should definitely check them out, and links are in the show notes. Now, the details are finally here for the Agora Day one-day conference, now known as the Intelligent Speech Conference 2019. This event will feature speeches, question and answer sessions, roundtable conversations, and much more. Speakers and guests will include many of your favorite Agora Podcast Network podcasters, including David Crowther of the History of England podcast. And not only that, we will also have special guests, including the host of the Revolutions and History of Rome podcasts, Mike Duncan, and Kevin Stroud of the History of English podcast. And we're still even adding more podcasters. You will not want to miss this great event, sponsored by Flick. For more information and to register, go to the website www.intelligentspeechconference.com. That's www.intelligentspeechconference.com. I really sincerely appreciate you taking the time to listen today. I want to give a special thanks to Stuart for his generous PayPal donation, along with my other PayPal donators. You can support the show through PayPal, my Amazon wish list, where you buy a book for me to use in my researches, and through your ratings and reviews on iTunes. I look forward to seeing you on our next step on our trip through the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Thanks for joining us today as we talk about the conversion of the Anglo Saxons. We're going to talk about the complicated cultural, political, and religious situation of the British Isles in the 400s and 500s AD. This episode will fit into the larger story of how different peoples, also known as barbarians, entered the Roman Empire and mixed with the existing populations. We talked about the Vandals a while back. We also talked about the Franks. Today, we will talk about the Anglo Saxons, and we will definitely get into the Visigoths in Spain in an upcoming episode. Today, we are joined by a special guest to help navigate us through this complicated time. If you listen to my other podcast, Beyond the Big Screen, or Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast, then you will be familiar with Professor James Early. James is an adjunct professor of history at San Jacinto College in Pasadena, Texas, just near Houston. He has published one book and 2 scholarly articles. He also runs a blog and Facebook group both called American History Fanatics. His main areas of research and interest include Eastern European history, the American Civil War, and the Cold War. Thank you so much for coming on today, James.
It's great to be here, Steve. I'm honored and excited to be on this podcast for the first time. I'm a long-time listener, first-time guest.
Now, a lot of people do know you as an American history guy. Why are we talking to you today about Anglo-Saxon church history?
That's a very good question. That's fair. Well, my reputation, I guess, as an American history person is relatively recent because when I was doing my master's And even before my master's, I was really into European history. And I don't know, for whatever reason, I just got interested in the Anglo Saxons. They're largely forgotten today, and people just don't know that much about them. And they have this fascinating language they spoke, Old English, which has some similarities to what we speak today, but in many ways is very, very different. So I just started reading about the Anglo Saxons. I even got some information on the language and some courses on tape or CD. I said tape. I'm dating myself there. Anyway, I learned a little of the language and read a little of their writing in the original language. Not too much. It's fairly challenging, but I just read one book and I thought it was really great. So I read another book and another book and another book. And for long, I'd really built up some knowledge about the political history of the Anglo-Saxons, but also their church history, because church history has always been a hobby of mine. I've read quite a bit on church history in general. And so that's how I got into that. My specialty in my master's program, as I mentioned, was European history. And I focused mainly on Southeastern Europe, especially the Balkans, Serbia, Bulgaria, and the other countries in that area. But I did take a whole course on the Anglo-Saxons, which I actually designed myself. I approached this one professor who specialized in Western Europe, and I said, how about teaching a course on the Anglo-Saxons? And he says, I don't really know that much about them, but if you want to design a course, I'll supervise it. So I picked out the readings and assigned myself a bunch of papers, and we did it. So there it is. It's been a while since I've done a lot of study on the Anglo-Saxons, but hopefully we'll be okay today.
Let's dive right in here and tell us, what was the religious and cultural political situation in England at the time of the Anglo-Saxon invasions? We're talking like early 400s. What was going on there?
Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to back up even a little bit further just to go kind of from the very beginning. The original inhabitants, the inhabitants of the British Isles, if you will, at the time of the Roman invasion, were Celtic peoples. And they weren't even originally from Britain. It's believed that long ago, a couple, 2,000-3,000 years ago, they migrated into the British Isles from the continent of Europe. But by the time the Romans showed up, they had been there for quite some time. And so the people spoke a Celtic language, or a series of Celtic languages. I'm sure they had at least different dialects, if not different languages. Or they would have been similar to the modern Irish language or the Scottish Gaelic language or Welsh, but of course much earlier forms of those, and probably not intelligible by modern speakers of Celtic languages. So the Romans decided to go over there. Our old buddy Julius Caesar, who loved to travel around and conquer things, never met a country he didn't want to conquer, right? But Caesar shows up in 55 BC, but he didn't establish permanent control of Britain. It was almost just like a excursion, if you will, with forces. He went over there and busted some heads and then went back home, and we know what happened to him. But the Romans later went back, about 100 years later, 43 AD, under the Emperor Claudius, and then they set up permanent control, or at least long-term control of the British Isles. And what happened was you had a blended culture. The Romans set up what they always did everywhere they went. They set up cities, they set up camps, they set up baths. All the trappings of Roman society were introduced into Britain, and the inhabitants there, a lot of them really liked it. Some of them didn't and rebelled from time to time, and the Romans would brutally put it down, as they do. But for the most part, you developed a blended culture, which is usually called Romano-British, or I may just eventually just call it British, but with some elements of Roman culture and some elements of British culture. I need to talk about Christianity too. Christianity, of course, comes along with the Romans. We don't know when the first Christians or the first conversions occurred in the British Isles. There's a legend of Joseph of Arimathea going to Britain and introducing Christianity and taking the cup of Christ and all that. But that's probably just a legend. There's no way to prove it or disprove it. But we know that there was definitely a Christian presence no later than the 3rd century. It may have even come earlier than that. We just don't know. There's no solid archaeological evidence that clearly tells us any dates, and there's not much written evidence. We know about St. Alban, the first martyr who died in Britain in the mid-3rd century, but so Christianity was there pretty early on, 3rd century, maybe even 2nd century. But that doesn't mean that the pagan practices that the Celtic people had practiced, they were pagans just like almost all European inhabitants. They had several gods. We don't know too much about their deities. But what developed after the Romans came, before they brought Christianity, of course, they brought their pantheon and their, I guess you would call it polytheism. They brought their gods. And what would happen is, as often happened in a polytheistic system, is you develop this hybrid where the Romans would say, well, who are your gods? And they would say, well, this is our god of the sky. This is our god of the water. And they would just introduce them into the Roman pantheon. So you got to blend it. Or they would even combine gods, which is not uncommon in polytheistic systems, as already mentioned. So there was quite a bit of pagan practice, and it was still present by the time the Anglo Saxons appeared, although I think Christianity was probably more dominant, especially in the cities. In the rural areas, as is usually the case at this time in Europe, you still had a lot of paganism going on. There is evidence for the strength of Christianity, including things like the fact that, well, there's independent testimony from writers like Tertullian and Origen, who both were writing around 200 AD. They allude to a strong Christian presence in Britain. There were British bishops, sorry, I can't say it, but there were bishops who traveled to other parts of the empire. There were actually three, at least we have a source that says there were 3 British bishops at the Council of Arles. That was in 314. It condemned the Donatist heresy. So they traveled quite a ways to go to that council. The British Church was also represented by bishops at the councils of Sardica, 347, and Arminium, 359. You also have the story of St. Patrick, which shows that English Christianity was strong enough to send missionaries over to Ireland to try to convert the Irish. And the Irish are going to return the favor later, as we'll see. But the fact that Patrick was an Englishman, the story of St. Patrick says that his father and grandfather, one of them was a deacon and one was a priest. I forget off the top of my head. But so it's clear that you had a significant Christian presence. In fact, one of the ways to tell if your practice or your presence, your Christian presence is strong is, do you have an original heresy pop up? So we know in the East there were so many heresies or deviant or different ways of expressing the faith. But the Pelagian heresy or Pelagian, which St. Augustine of Hippo is going to fight against, that actually originated in Britain. Pelagius, the originator of that heresy or that practice or that belief, that he was from Britain. So there you go. It's strong enough to have an original heresy. So it's believed that, again, just to sum up, that when the Anglo Saxons arrived in the 5th century, there was a substantial Christian presence, but also quite a bit of paganism hanging around, especially in the rural areas.
What do we know about the actual ecclesiastical and the church organizational structure in Roman Britain?
Unfortunately, we do not know as much as we would like. We don't know hardly anything, to be honest with you. We don't have any documents saying, okay, the British church had a bishop in this city and an archbishop in this city and a bishop here and a bishop there. That's lacking. Scholars, well, I want to back up and just say that archaeological evidence, there is some, but it's always open to interpretation. I guess any type of evidence is, but archaeological evidence is especially hard to interpret sometimes. We know, as I mentioned earlier, that there were at least 3 bishops in Britain at the Council of Arles who went to the Council of Arles in 314. So maybe there would have been at that time more than 3 bishops. I mean, it doesn't seem like they would send all their bishops, right? Somebody's got to stay behind and run the church. But anyway, by the early 4th century, the British Christian community was both organized on a regional basis and it held a distinct episcopal hierarchy. And there are a few I guess, tantalizing tidbits left behind. We've got inscriptions and other evidence that have names of specific bishops. We don't know anything about them other than that they have their name in an inscription. For example, I was looking up and I saw that on the Risley Park Lanks, there's a fragmentary inscription stating Bishop Exuperius gave this to, and then we can't read the rest, but so there's one bishop. There's a lead salt pan from Shavington in Cheshire, which contains a Latin inscription which reads of Viventius the bishop. But other than that, we just don't know that much. It's frustrating.
The Romano-British, they're doing their thing for a while, and then a lot of things start changing in the western end of the Roman Empire, and different groups are starting to move along, and that's when the Anglo Saxons come into the story. Who were the Anglo Saxons, and why did they come to the British Isles?
Anglo Saxons is a term that's used for Germanic peoples who lived on the North Sea coast, stretching all the way from what is now Denmark down to what is now the Netherlands, and then, of course, in parts of Germany as well. They left for a variety of reasons. One possible reason, based on some archaeological evidence and some actual kind of environmental evidence that I've read, is that some of their land was being either flooded or made untenable for other reasons. So they weren't able to do the farming that they had always done. And so they were going looking for greener pastures. But another reason, which is very significant, is that they were essentially being hired as mercenaries or a private army by some of these Romano-British. As you mentioned earlier, there was a lot of movement of peoples in the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries, and things were really getting bad. You were starting to have all these barbarian tribes coming in. Whether or not that was an invasion or a migration, scholars debate that. But one thing is certain, is that the Romans pulled all their legions out of England in 410. We know that. So we have solid documentary evidence for that. And they basically told the local rulers to fend for themselves. They just said, "We're out, guys, so good luck." And even before that, there had been migrations or invasions or both of Germanic peoples coming in to Britain, looking for work, looking for land, looking for a better life. But it got really intense after 410, after the Roman legions were pulled out. And I'm just going to call them British now, okay? So when I say British from here on, I'm talking about the Celtic peoples who the Romans left behind. It's much easier to say than Romano-British. So the British were dealing with migrations or invasions or some combination thereof of all kinds of people. You had Scots attacking from the north, Irish attacking from the west. Actually, I should clarify that the Scots were originally Irish people. The Scots came from Ireland and moved to what is now Scotland. But you had Irish kind of people, and Picts were attacking, and you had Saxons attacking, and other Germanic peoples from the North Sea coast. So all hell is breaking loose in Britain. And so here's the story. One of the main leaders, and we don't know what kind of political structure the Romans left behind when they pulled out. We don't know how many different kingdoms or principalities or political units there were, but we do have some documentary evidence from our sources. And I have to stop and say the main sources, we don't have a lot of sources from this time, and the ones we have are written much after the events. We have Gildas. Gildas was probably a Welsh monk who was writing around 550. He wrote a document, but it's mainly a sermon. It's really a Jeremiad condemning the British rulers of the time for their lax practice of Christianity, but it does have some political and military kind of things listed in there. You also have the Ecclesiastical History of the English People by the Venerable Bede, which is a wonderful work. I recommend that everybody read it. It's not very long, and it's pretty easy to read. Bede was writing around 730 or so that's 300 years after what we're talking about. And then you have the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and that's even later. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was most likely begun under the reign of King Alfred the Great, which is in the late 800s. So, but that's all we have to go by. Well, there's a few other sources that have little tidbits, but we just don't have a whole lot of things that were written at the time. Now, having said that, the sources tell us that there was a Roman ruler, Vortigern, and he supposedly, to help fight off these people coming in, these Scots and these Picts and these others that were invading England or Britain, he calls over across the channel to some Germanic peoples and asks them to come over and be his soldiers, his private army. And I want to read a selection from the Anglo Saxon Chronicle. The date of this is 449, but as I mentioned, it was written much later. So you mind if I do that? It's not too lengthy, but I think it's very informative.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Okay, so this is what the Chronicle says. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is exactly what it sounds like. It's just a list of dates, and it says, in this year, something happened. In this year, something happened, and so on. It can be dry at times, but other times it's very interesting. So 449, the entry is this. This year, Martianus and Valentinian succeeded to the kingdom and ruled 7 years. In their days, Vortigern invited the Anglo race here, and they came here to Britain in 3 ships at Ebba's Creek. King Vortigern gave them land in the southeast of this land on condition that they fought against the Picts. This they did, and had victory wherever they went. Then they sent to Angeln, ordered them to send more help, and ordered them to tell of the worthlessness of the Britons, meaning the people of Britain, and the excellence of the land. They then at once sent here a larger troop to help the other. These men came from 3 tribes of Germany, from the Old Saxons, from the Angles, and from the Jutes. From the Jutes came the men of Kent and the men of White, and the race of Wessex. From the Old Saxons came the East Saxons, South Saxons, and West Saxons. From Angeln, which has stood waste ever since between the Jutes and the Saxons, came the East Angles, Middle Angles, Mercians, and all the Northumbrians. Their commanders were 2 brothers, Hengist and Horsa. First of all, they killed and drove away all the king's enemies, and then they turned on the king and the British, destroying through fire and the sword's edge. So this is the official story, this idea that there were 2 brothers, they brought over some warriors on 3 ships, but that there's probably a kernel of truth in this, but at the same time, as is usually the case with these kind of situations in early history, what really happened is probably much more complicated. There were probably other peoples, including Frisians, Franks, and Danes, migrating to England around this time as well.
There are a lot of other fascinating conversations around that too, with language and culture, but that could take us off on a lot of different angles,
yeah,
if you will. Also, if you are interested in reading the history of the English people from Bede, it's available online pretty easily if you just search for that, or you go to the Fordham University Medieval Sourcebook. They have it they have the whole book in there, which is pretty easy to read.
Yeah, it's divided into short little sections. Very, very doable. Very, very interesting book.
You say that that's the official story, and you say that things are a little bit more complicated. And I like to start with the official story because then you can start to dissect it a bit. Let's dissect the official story of the Anglo-Saxons come, they conquer, and everything becomes Anglo-Saxon. What was really going on in the British Isles in this period of the 400s going into the 500s?
Well, that's the problem, Steve, is we just don't know. That's something that people hate to hear. We don't have that much evidence. We definitely know that there were attacks from the north and from the west on the Romano-British, or just the British, if you will. And as far as these names, Vortigern and Valentinian and Martianus, we just don't know anything about these fellas. We don't even know that they really existed. I mean, I tend to be trusting of the sources as much as I can. So I'm sure they probably were real people, but they were seeing their lands overrun by invaders, these wild, crazy Scots and the Picts from the north. And I'm picturing the movie Braveheart. I probably shouldn't because it's not very accurate. But you think about the Scots with their faces painted. The Picts were the people that actually painted themselves, and they needed help, and they didn't have Roman soldiers, and they couldn't raise their own army. So they thought, well, there's all these Germanic guys over there across, and some of them had already come over. There were Anglo-Saxons who had settled in Britain before this massive invasion occurred. So they thought, well, these guys are good fighters. Well, let's get some more over. We'll make them into an army. We'll give them some land and everybody will be happy.
Something that doesn't often get told in the story is that the British did fight back. And there was a period of about 150 years where the Celts and the British and the Anglo-Saxons are living together. What was that situation between the two in that pretty long stretch of time?
It's really more like about a 50-year period. So the big wave of Anglo-Saxon settlers, and it was definitely more than just 3 ships. Even this official, quote-unquote official story from the Chronicle mentions more coming later. But they came over and they fought and they defeated the enemies of this King Vortigern, or leader Vortigern. We don't even know if he was a king. And then they seem to have looked around and said, hey, you know what? This is a pretty nice place. Good weather. There's not very many people here. Maybe we can have it for ourselves. And so they rebelled against their leader. And that's when they really started conquering much of what we call England today, starting in the southeast. So they started in the southeast, which makes sense. It's closer to the continent. And then they seem to have fought against the British and pushed them back and pushed them north and west. But around 500 AD, it seems, according to the sources, that there was kind of a stop of the advance of the Anglo-Saxons. The British fought back. They checked the advance. There's a man mentioned named Aurelius Ambrosius, I believe. But this man is actually believed to be the real-life inspiration behind the King Arthur legend. So, I don't know, maybe picture the King Arthur movie that came out maybe 10 years ago or so, where it had...
Owen,
I can't even remember who.
King Arthur.
I think Keira Knightley was in it. You know that one? I didn't see it, but it wasn't like your typical Camelot movie with the round table and all that. I mean, they were wearing armor, Roman style armor and all that. But at any rate, I'm getting off track here, but there seems to have been peace for about 50 years. So from about 500 to 550 AD. But then the Anglo-Saxons went on the offensive again, defeated the British, and they pushed them back out of most of what we call England today. They pushed them mostly into Wales, into Scotland, and southwestern Britain as well. They didn't really mix a whole lot, as far as we can tell. They seem to have generally kept separate, with Anglo-Saxons living mostly, as I mentioned, in southeast England, and the British living in the west, the southwest, and the north. Now, the big question historically is, how much of this was a total conquest? Was there a genocide? Did the Anglo-Saxons kill all the British people that didn't flee and get away? Well, we don't know. Scholars tend to think, for the most part, I think most scholars would say that there was not really a genocide. Sure, they killed a lot of the men. A lot of that was just what happens in battle. But they seem to have, as again, we see this is another thing we see a lot in history. They let the women live. They let the children live for the most part, and they took the women as their wives. And they may have let some of the men live as well. And so there is some British influence, British or Celtic influence on the Anglo-Saxons, but not a lot. We don't see that many Celtic words in the Anglo-Saxon or the Old English language. It's mainly place names. Place names are very conservative, and people tend to keep them, even if they conquer the people that gave these places the names they gave them.
If I'm not mistaken, the genetic evidence that's starting to come out now is that there was a lot more mixture, but it's clear from the cultural and linguistic evidence that the culture of the British was pushed to the margins over the course of those centuries. Is that accurate to say? Yeah, definitely. There's a fascinating book about this, which came out, it's probably been close to 15 years now, but it's called Saxons, Vikings, and Celts. Have you read that? No. That's a cool book. I can't remember the name of the author. I've read it twice, and they find out that a lot of British have a lot of Viking DNA in them. Of course, the Vikings, that's way after what we're talking about now, but there's a lot of mixture, definitely a lot of mixture. The Anglo-Saxons established many small kingdoms throughout their area, and some they joined together, they split apart, but there was essentially the big seven: Northumbria, East Anglia, which was kind of in the east, Essex, Kent, Sussex, Wessex, and Mercia. What was the situation and background of those different powers?
Yeah, well, as we saw in the excerpt from the Anglo Saxon Chronicle, the chroniclers wanted to make this really simple, and they said, okay, the people of Angeln, which is in extreme northern Germany / southern Denmark. Angeln, it's still a place name today, but the people of Angeln were the Angles, and they came over and established East Anglia and Northumbria, and then the Saxons, which is a little bit deeper into Germany, they came over and founded Essex, which Essex is just East Saxony, or the kingdom of the East Saxons. Sussex is South Saxony, and Wessex is West Saxony. And then they said that the Jutes came from modern-day Denmark. Some people don't even believe that there were Jutes. I've heard all kinds of interesting discussions on that. But for the most part, there is a place called Jutland. We know that. It was a famous battle in World War I. So there probably were a few tribes that called themselves Jute. And they supposedly established Kent and the island of Wight and Mercia. But I may have those mixed up a little there. But it's obviously that's a very clean and simple version of history where just one entire tribe packs up and moves and resettles themselves in another place. And history almost never works out like that. Probably these people that formed these different kingdoms, they probably were from all over the continent. As we mentioned, there were probably Frisians, which is from in modern day Netherlands and Belgium. There were some Franks. There were probably even some people from Scandinavia. But what happened is they rallied around a single leader, and a king at first was just a war leader, the leader of a war band. If you've read Beowulf, I'm sure you have, Steve, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners have. Beowulf was, and the king, Hrothgar, was the leader of a war band, and they would build a nice hall, and they would sit around drinking mead and throwing bones at each other and things like that, telling great stories and going off and slaying evil monsters. Okay, not the monster part, but they'd go slay other peoples and animals. But over time, they became more organized, more centralized, more and more leaders or warriors would join up with these war leaders, and pretty soon you had what they called a kingdom. And as we saw, you had a lot of small tribes at first, but there was a centralizing process, and you had these 7 main kingdoms arise. And as you mentioned, there were others. There was a kingdom called Lindsey that would pop up from time to time and then would be subsumed into Northumbria or East Anglia. But what would happen is, even with these 7, a lot of times one of them would come out as the top dog. You would have these tribes or these kingdoms, but you would also have one of the kings who the others would pay homage to or acknowledge as their over king, or the super king, if you will, the king over the kings. And so I want to mention just some of those. And this title, it wasn't an official title or anything, but it was an informal title, but it was called Bretwalda, which is basically ruler of the Britons. And we're given a list of 7 of these, the ecclesiastical history of Bede. So he mentions one named Alla, king of the South Saxons, is the first one. Caon, king of the West Saxons, that would be Wessex. And then Athelbert, king of Kent, and we're going to talk a lot about him a little bit later. Then Radwald, king of East Anglia. And then it shifts up to Northumbria, the northernmost kingdom, Edwin and Oswald and Oswy. Now, again, are those the only ones? Probably not. There were probably others, but Bede has simplified it to 7. 7, of course, is a special number in Christian theology. So yeah, you would have from time to time one of the kings that would be kind of the boss, the head honcho, and the others would send him tribute or something. We don't really know exactly how they would acknowledge that. But it was nothing like saying, okay, we submit to him. There's not a unified England, and there will not be for a long time, not until after the reign of Alfred the Great. So that really affects the church history as well. The fact that you don't have a unified kingdom makes it very, very hard to have a unified church. But we'll get into that later.
What was the effect of the Anglo-Saxon invasion on Christianity in England?
Once again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the evidence is not completely clear. Scholars are divided. Surprise, surprise. I think scholars divide as part of their job, right?
Yeah, that's in the description.
If you write papers and books and all you ever say is, yeah, I agree with everything out there that's already, you're not going to be famous. You're not going to get tenure. You have to argue. You have to say, no, what everybody else said is wrong. And here's a new theory. So that's just the nature of the business. But it's also based on finding new evidence and other, just reading the sources in a fresh way. But anyway, so having said that, scholars are divided. Some claim that Christianity in England was nearly wiped out by the Anglo-Saxon invasions. Others claim that a significant number of Christians remain. So there you go. And the truth is probably somewhere in between. But it seems that most Christians fled to Wales, Scotland, and southwestern Britain. And that would be the areas called Devon and Cornwall in the little boot that sticks out in southwest England. And those, of course, those lay outside of Saxon control until the time of Alfred the Great. In fact, some of them weren't controlled by the English until much, much later, like Wales, for example.
It's fascinating. It would be really nice to know what was going on more on the ground level than the 10,000 foot level.
It really would. But the Anglo-Saxons were illiterate at first, and they didn't leave behind any kind of documentary evidence. And I'm sure the British, at least the church leaders, would have been literate. Probably the common people were not for the most part. But a lot of what they wrote would have been destroyed in all the fighting, or they might have taken it with them, and things just get lost over the centuries. So it is a shame that we don't know more than we do.
How does Christianity get reintroduced to England? I guess that's kind of a tricky word to say. How do the Anglo-Saxons get introduced to Christianity, which brings Christianity back to the fore in the British Isles?
That's a great question. We do know more about that. Before I answer that, though, let me back up a step and mention what was the religion of the Anglo-Saxons. I think that's significant.
That's a good thing to talk about.
Yeah, it's just kind of important. So they came in, they did have their own religion. They were pagan. They worshipped essentially the same gods as the Vikings. We all know about Thor and Odin. We've watched the movies and throwing around the hammer and tossing around thunderbolts and all that. So you had similar gods to those. They had, instead of Odin, they worshipped Woden. He was very important, the king of the gods, or the head god. Thor, they did worship Thor. They had a god named To. A lot of the names of our days of the week are named after them. So, of course, Sunday is named after the sun, and Monday is named after the moon. But Tuesday is named after To, the god of war. Wednesday is Woden's day. Thursday is Thor's day. Freya was another god that the Anglo-Saxons worshipped, and they were pretty devout, fairly devout religious people. They were devoted to their religion. So when this North Germanic paganism then became the dominant religion in England for the time being. Okay, now let's get to the reintroduction of Christianity. We have two sources. And when I say two sources, I don't mean two books or two major archaeological digs or anything like that. We have several of those. We have much better documentary evidence for what's going on during this period. But to sum it up, and then I'll go in a little bit deeper in just a minute. But to sum it up, Christianity was reintroduced into England, aka introduced to the Anglo-Saxons from Rome on one hand, and on the other hand, from the West and the North, from the Irish. So let's go ahead and talk about Rome first, if that's okay, right?
And so that's an important thing to keep in your mind, that they're getting Christianity from two separate directions. That's going to be important.
Right. And they're not exactly the same. The way of practicing Christianity among the Irish and the way of practicing it among the Romans has some significant differences, and that's going to cause some problems later, but we'll save that for a little bit later. So in the late 6th century, very late, in the 590s, 595 or so, Pope Gregory I, we all know and love Gregory the Great. In the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, he's called Gregory the Dialogist. because he wrote a famous work called the Dialogues. But one of the greatest popes, most significant popes in church history, Gregory I, he sends a group of 40 monks under the leadership of Augustine, and this is Augustine of Canterbury, not to be confused with the famous Augustine of Hippo, the theologian. He's been dead for a long time at this point. But Gregory decides to send 40 monks to England. Now, why did he do this? I didn't put this in the notes, but I can't resist telling the story. You're probably familiar with this as well, I'm sure, Steve, and a lot of our listeners will be. But according to I'm not the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, according to Bede, Pope Gregory was down at the slave market one day in Rome, and he saw these really fair-skinned, very light-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed boys standing there waiting to be sold as slaves. And that they stuck out, right? Because Romans tend to be darker complected and tend to have darker hair. So he said, "Who are these people?" to this one of his aides that was with him. And the guy says, "Well, they're Angles," meaning they're from Anglo-Saxon England. They're of the tribe of the Angles. And Gregory says, "No, they're not Angles, but they're angels," which is a play on words. It's a pun in Latin as well as in English. And Gregory says, "What is the name of their the kingdom that they come from?" And the man says, "Well, they're from Deira." And I should say Deira is half of Northumbria. Northumbria was a kingdom that was made up of two smaller kingdoms, Deira and Bernicia, and sometimes they would be together and sometimes they would be part. But so he says they're from Deira, and Gregory says, "Oh, well, they shall be rescued from the wrath of God then." Because if you look at Latin, de ira means from wrath or from anger. So another pun there for Gregory. And then Gregory says to the man, "Well, what is the name of their king?" And he says, "Allah." And Gregory says, "Alleluia." So, and you listen to some scholars and they'll say, "There's no way this is true." Well, how do you know that? I mean, how do you know it's definitely not true? Others are skeptical. Others say, well, it could have happened. I'm just going to say it might be true. That might be one reason Gregory decided to reach out to these people. I think there's other reasons too. I think Gregory was very much a Roman at heart, and he wanted to spread Romanitas or Romanness to as much of Europe as he could. He knew that the province of Britannia, which is now Anglo-Saxon England at this time, it had been a key part of the Roman Empire, and he wanted to bring it back into the Roman fold. Even there's no centralized Roman Empire anymore, at least not in the West. But there was the concept of Christendom, and everybody was trying to outdo each other in how Roman they were. All these barbarians who were now occupying the former Roman provinces. So I think that's part of it too. He just wanted to bring them back into the Roman fold. And it's possible even that the king of Kent at the time, Athelbert, we mentioned him a little bit ago, Athelbert may have invited Gregory. We don't have any letter, any documents saying that, but there's always politics involved in church history, and especially in this time. Athelbert may have wanted to connect himself more to the Franks and to the rest of Christian Europe. He had a wife who was a Frankish princess, and she was a Christian. So Athelbert, even though he was originally pagan, married a Christian wife. Maybe she exercised some influence over him. Wives tend to do that, don't they, Steve?
Yeah, they sure do.
So there's a lot of reasons. We can't point to just one reason why Augustine decided to send missionaries to the Anglo-Saxons. I think it's a combination of all the reasons we've discussed.
Gregory had some reasons to push Christianity there. Was there some pull factors? A lot of these things, the reasons why of the conversion stories sound a lot like other conversion stories of people like the Franks. What were some of the pulls that made people maybe in England at that time want to become Christians? Were they trying to maybe plug into the continental situation more so?
Definitely. I think they wanted to have closer connections to the Franks and to the Italians and the other Christian kingdoms of the time. Just the idea that being Roman was cool. It was neat, and everybody wanted it. I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of these we've seen with the Franks and with the Goths and others that had come in, the Burgundians. they wanted some of that Roman culture and some of that Roman, and the religion is part of it. And there's also the aspect of power. Power is a very important concept that we often forget about. These kings wanted to be powerful. They wanted to have power over their enemies. And they had seen how the Franks, for example, to state perhaps the most obvious example, the Franks had received Christianity, and they had really, after that, started kicking some butt. It seemed like the old gods, the pagan gods, just didn't seem to be very powerful anymore. But the God of Christianity seemed to grant a lot of power to his followers. So that's another thing. There may have been spiritual reasons too. I don't want to say that this is all purely cultural and political. They may have been won over by the arguments of some of the missionaries, but we definitely can't discount the political and the cultural aspects of converting to Christianity.
You can say that many of the factors that led from Christianity, of why it spread from its earliest days, are really just continuing on even up into the 600s.
Absolutely. Can I recommend a book? There's a fantastic book, and this is the very first book I ever read in my master's program. It's called The Barbarian Conversion, From Paganism to Christianity.
I have that book.
You have that one?
Yeah.
It's an amazing book. It reads almost like a novel, very well written, easy to read. It's not short. It's about 500 pages or so, but this author, Richard Fletcher, he goes to everybody from the earliest conversions all the way down to like Lithuania in the 1300s. So they were the last holdouts in Europe to become Christians. So very good book. Talks a lot about the conversion of the Franks as well as the conversion of the Anglo Saxons and others. And he also gives you vignettes and little life stories of the various missionaries that went out. And a lot of them are going to be sent out from Anglo-Saxon England later. So great book. If y'all are interested in this topic more, you definitely want to read this book.
I'll put links to all of these books and the Venerable Bede book in the show notes as well. So if I don't do that, audience, remind me to do that.
Yeah, let us know, or let Steve know. So let me continue on with the story. So Augustine arrives, as I mentioned, in 597, almost 600, and he preaches to King Athelbert. And Athelbert at first doesn't want to buy into it. He doesn't convert right away, but he does give them permission to preach in Kent. And so Augustine and the other missionaries start preaching. They set up a church. They start having services. They set up a monastery, and they start keeping a monastic rule. And eventually they win up to maybe 10,000 converts. They win quite a few converts. And eventually the king himself, Athelbert, finally does convert. And Augustine is consecrated as the very first Archbishop of Canterbury. And this is interesting. We may have listeners that wonder, why is the head of the Church of England in Canterbury? Why not in London?
Yeah.
It's a very good question. It seems like in some ways it ought to be London, right? Because London is the capital city of Great Britain and has been for a long, long time. But at this time, London was small potatoes. London had been a major trading station and a port for the Romans, but it kind of fell apart after the Romans pulled out. And it's just a little town at this point. Canterbury is where it's at. Canterbury was the capital of the King of Kent. And again, remember that Kent is the most southeastern kingdom in England. It's closest to the Franks. It had the most connections with the continent. So it's very logical that the very first place where the church in England would be set up, at least in terms of the Roman mission, it makes sense that it would be Canterbury. And it just never left. It always retained its position as the number one bishopric in all of England.
There's a big push of conversions, and this is when Augustine of Canterbury comes to England. There's some big leaders like King Raedwald of the East Angles, and you said that he had a half conversion. Maybe you can explain that half conversion process. I thought that was really interesting.
And that's not uncommon in Christian history. And the first wave of converts are often they don't become fully Bible believing, fully, completely Orthodox practicing Christians. I should say before I jump into that there were reinforcements sent in 601. Pope Gregory sent more monks up to help out Augustine, and they were sending letters back and forth too. They brought relics, they brought vestments, and they brought other church supplies. And in 604, a second kingdom becomes Christian, at least nominally or at least officially, the East Saxons or Essex, and a bishopric is established at London. So again, London doesn't even get a bishop and a see, S-E-E, if you will, or a bishopric. They don't even get it until 604, which is 7 years after Augustine first came. I should also, before I get into Radwald, I'm going to clarify that Augustine, we call him Augustine of Canterbury because that's where he settled and that's where he served as archbishop. But he was actually Italian. All these guys that are coming over are Romans. Augustine and his compadres, his helper-outers, if you will. That's not a real word, but you get the idea. They're all Italians. So these are your people, Steve. Yeah. They're Italian immigrants to England, and the first several archbishops of Canterbury are going to be Italians. It's going to take a while for them to raise up some native leadership. All right, so let's move on to Radwald. Radwald is the king of the East Angles. So we talked about the East Saxons becoming Christian. They are to the east of Kent. But if you go north from Kent, the next kingdom up is East Anglia. Radwald went down to visit Ethelbert of Kent, and at that time he was baptized. He declared himself a Christian, but when he went home, his wife said, "You did what?" It's funny. I love this story. Wives don't always agree with their husbands, do they, Steve?
No, they don't.
They don't like the decisions we make sometimes. I wonder why that is.
Especially on big things.
I'm going to get you.
That we don't tell them about.
Yeah, I'm going to get you in trouble here, and me too, probably. But anyway, so Radwald's wife was apparently a pretty gung-ho pagan, and she said, no. Forget this. You're not going to become a Christian. You're staying pagan. So he tries to split the difference. He says, well, okay, I'll add Christ to my personal pantheon of gods. There's always room for one more, right? So he sets up a temple with two altars. The temple has a pagan altar, and then it also has an altar dedicated to Christ. So that's what I mean by a half conversion. And what we're going to see, or what we see when we study the history of the church in England, the early churches, there's a lot of regressions to paganism. For example, the son of King Ethelbert of Kent, who takes over after his death, he doesn't convert, and he tries to make Kent a pagan kingdom again, but eventually he does convert. So it's not a linear progression of, okay, this kingdom now becomes Christian, and so they're Christian forever and ever, amen. There's a lot of times when they'll go back to being pagans, and then they'll go back to being Christians again, but eventually they do settle into Christianity. All right, so the next kingdom up from East Anglia, where our buddy Radwald was ruling, was Northumbria. And I already mentioned that Northumbria was a hybrid kingdom of two smaller kingdoms that were originally there, Deira in the south and Bernicia in the north. And there were two ruling lines, and they had a lot of conflict. They would fight sometimes, and the kingdoms would split up, and then they'd come back together. But in 627, the king of Northumbria, unified at this time, was named Edwin. Edwin decides to convert to Christianity, and there's a great story about how that happens, but you're going to have to read Bede to get it. We don't have time to go into the detailed story. Essentially, the Kentish church sent up a missionary to Edwin, and along with his future wife, who was also Christian. And again, we see the theme of wives influencing their husbands religiously. It happens again here in Northumbria. So Edwin and his court convert to Christianity. And then later, Christianity spreads to Sussex, or South Saxon Kingdom, to Wessex, and finally to Mercia. The Mercians were the last ones to hold out, but they converted later in the roughly mid-7th century, around 640, 650. I always call the Mercians the bad boys of Anglo-Saxon England because they went up and they're going to kill Edwin. Their king goes to battle with Edwin and kills him, and then later they kill Oswald again, another Christian king of Northumbria. And both of them are saints, by the way, Saint Oswald, Saint Edwin, and Ethelbert is a saint as well. Radwald, surprise, surprise, is not a saint. Okay, so So that's basically the spread of Roman Christianity. Roman Christianity, as we have seen, to sum up, it comes obviously from Rome on the orders of Pope Gregory, being brought by Augustine of Canterbury and his companions. And it starts in Kent, and then it spreads north and west. But there is a second a source of Christianity being reintroduced into England. That is the Irish. The Irish had received Christianity largely due to the influence of the Romano-British, think St. Patrick. And so Wales and Ireland and Scotland, and especially Ireland, had become devoutly Christian and especially monastic. Monasticism was huge in Ireland. Ireland has a very different type of organization from the Roman system. Church organization is what I mean. The Roman form of church organization, the ecclesiology, if you will, was based around cities, because cities were obviously the fundamental building blocks of the Roman Empire. So you would have a large city, you would have a bishop in that city. Over time, that bishop tends to gain dominance over the bishops in the surrounding cities, and he gets the title of metropolitan or archbishop. But that doesn't happen in Ireland. Ireland is broken up into dozens, if not hundreds, of small kingdoms ruled by just these little petty kings, almost like tribes that we see among the Native Americans or the Germanic peoples long ago. So the Irish don't have big cities. So their ecclesiology is centered around monasteries, and abbots of monasteries have an influence and a role very similar to bishops in the Roman world. And one of these abbots sent a monk named Columba. Columba was sent from Ireland over to an island called Iona, which is on the west coast of Britain near Scotland. He establishes the monastery at Iona, and it becomes a major heartbeat of Christianity in northern Britain. And one of their monks named St. Aidan of Iona, later immigrates over to Lindisfarne, which is in Anglo-Saxon territory. It's in Northumbria. It's an island off the coast, but the other side of England. He establishes a famous monastery called Lindisfarne. So let me back that up again and say, originally you had Columba was sent from Ireland. He established Iona. And then later one of the Ionian monks, Aidan, goes over into England and forms Lindisfarne. And Lindisfarne, being founded by this Irish missionary, Aidan, St. Aidan, becomes a key center of Christianity in the north. And this is also a key center of Irish style, or I should technically say Ionian style Christianity. One scholar has written that Lindisfarne superseded Canterbury as the effective ecclesiastical center of England for 30 years. Under Aidan's leadership, Lindisfarne sent missionary monks to the other kingdoms and helped convert their kings and nobles to Christianity. And Edwin, that we mentioned earlier, even though he had received an emissary from Kent that had helped him convert to Christianity, even before that, he was influenced by Irish Christianity, these monks that had come over and founded Lindisfarne. And Oswald, the other king we mentioned of Northumbria, he was even more influenced. He had spent time in Scotland, and he learned the language, and so he ends up coming back and taking over as king, and he's a big proponent of the Irish style of Christianity.
And just to put it in your mind, Iona is on, if you're picturing the United Kingdom, Iona's on the left side, an island, and Lindisfarne's on the right side, and they're almost opposite of each other. Lindisfarne's just a little south.
Yeah, that's a good mental map. So again, to summarize, we have Irish style or Ionian style Christianity coming in from the west and the north, and then we have Roman Christianity coming from the south, and they're going to meet. And there's going to be a few conflicts, especially in Northumbria.
Let's talk about some of those conflicts. Those are really important conflicts. And they almost seem like small fry to us today, but they're really important. What were some of those conflicts?
Sure. As I mentioned, monasteries, even more than parish churches, become the heart and soul of Anglo-Saxon Christianity, especially in the north. I read a book called, I can't remember the title of it right now, but it was by a current English scholar named John Blair, and it was a long book in which he argues that monasteries gave rise to English cities. And in other words, you wouldn't have had towns if there weren't monasteries, but that's kind of not what you asked. So let me go on to what you asked. So as we mentioned, there were two types of Christian practice, the Roman and the Irish, or more technically the Ionian, because parts of the Irish church, the church in Ireland itself, were actually practicing the Roman style of Christianity. There were two main differences. So I don't want people to think that these are like two completely different forms of Christianity. It's not like Arian Christianity and Orthodox, or what we'd think of as regular Christianity. They weren't that different. The theology was the same.
It's fair to say it's a matter of practice.
Exactly. The one thing was the nature of the monastic tonsure. And again, all of us may be thinking, what? That's such a minor deal. How do you cut the hair of monks? The Roman style, we all are familiar with the Romans, where they would shave the very top of the head, the crown of the head, and they'd have kind of a, what would you call it, Steve? Just like a poof around the head. You think of Friar Tuck and all that. That was symbolic of a crown being put on you. But the Irish did it differently. They would shave the sides of the head, and they would leave a big mass of hair on top that would sometimes flop down. So more significant than the haircut was the date of Easter. And the date of Easter is not insignificant. You don't want... For example, let me give you a famous illustration. One of the kings of Northumbria was following I think he was following the Irish practice, and the wife was following the Roman practice. And so they celebrated Easter on a different day. And so one of them is fasting while the other is feasting. So that's kind of weird, Steve, don't you think? If you're having a big feast of 7-course dinner with lots of meat and lots of wine and all that, and your wife is eating veggies, it makes for not a lot of harmony around the table. And I'm laughing about it, but feasting was a super important part of Anglo-Saxon culture, as it is in a lot of cultures. And it's the way you reward your followers. It's the way you entertain people and show how rich and powerful you are. So you need to be on the same page with all of your followers and all the members of your family.
Well, it is worth saying that we've talked about in previous episodes that this was a highly controversial issue for many of the same reasons you said back in the 300s. And the date of Easter, as far as my knowledge, was that it was pretty much nailed down at the Council of Nicaea at 325. So not an insignificant council. What happened that made the issue of Easter come back up again, the dating of Easter?
Well, yeah, it was nailed down at Nicaea. And I want to say in passing that every now and then somebody will say the Irish were following the Orthodox practice and the Romans were following what is now the Roman Catholic and Protestant practice. But that's not true at all. The current Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church, they follow the same practice. It's just that they're on two different calendars. The Orthodox Church follows the Julian calendar, and the Roman Catholic Church follows the Gregorian calendar. So that's why today people may be wondering why Orthodox Christians and Roman Catholic and Protestant Christians celebrate Easter or Pascha on a different day. It has nothing to do with what's going on in England at the time. There wasn't even a Gregorian calendar yet at this time.
Yeah.
What the Irish were doing that was different from the Romans was they were following this 84-year liturgis cycle invented by a man named Sulpicius Severus in around 410. So they were following a different tradition than the one that was laid down at the Council of Nicaea in 325. Some people believe that was inefficient. Sometimes the calendar was off and you weren't sure, was Easter going to be this Sunday or the next Sunday? And sometimes a pope would just have to come down and make a decision. Oh, it's going to be this Sunday. So the monks of Iona and in other parts of Ireland, they just felt like this calendar they were following was more efficient and more accurate, I guess. So it's very, calculating the date of Easter is so complicated. I don't even want to touch it, but it's complicated. There's charts and tables and so on and so on. But the fact of the matter is the Romans said, hey, you guys need to get in line. We are doing what everybody else in the Roman world does. The Franks are following this, the Italians, even the weirdos out in Greece and the Byzantine, the Eastern Empire. They wouldn't have said Byzantine, but even the Greek weirdos are following it. You guys are the only ones that are not following the Roman, i.e. the correct practice of Easter. So you need to get your act together.
You're probably going to get into this. How did those two ideas of the Roman that the Anglo Saxons are starting to get into, but they're also being influenced by the Irish practice, how do those two get squared away, so to speak?
Well, there's a council called in 664. So by this time, all of Anglo-Saxon England is at least nominally Christian. There's still paganism floating around, of course. There always will be, to some degree at least, or at least there will be for a while. I shouldn't say always, but the king of Northumbria, Oswin, I believe, a lot of them start with Os, and I don't have them all memorized. It was either Oswi or Oswin, but he calls a council, and because this was mainly a Northumbrian thing, the churches in Kent and in Wessex and the other kingdoms, they were on the Roman practice firmly. The only quote unquote weirdos that were doing the quote unquote wrong thing were some of the people in Northumbria, because they had learned their Christianity from the Ionian tradition. So the king calls the Council of Whitby, and you have a long description of this in Bede, and it's very interesting, and I won't go into the details, but you have one bishop who argues the side of the Irish practice, or the Ionian practice more correctly, and then you have Bishop Wilfrid, and we'll talk more about him later. Wilfrid is an upcoming mover and shaker who argues for the Roman practice. And Wilfrid basically says, hey, we're following the practice of St. Peter. So, mic drop, that's it. Peter was given the keys to the kingdom by Jesus, and so who are you going to argue? Who are you to argue with him? And the other side tried to say, well, we're following St. John, or we're following this person, that person, but they lose out in the end. You just can't argue against Peter, right? So, and the king actually is the one that makes the ruling, and the king comes down on the side of the Roman practice. And it's funny because the Anglo-Saxon, Bede very cryptically says he gave his ruling and he did it with a smile. And scholars have made a lot out of that. What does that mean? He gave it with a smile. I'm not even sure I want to get into that. It's kind of like maybe he was just thinking, well, okay, this is going to happen anyway, and I'm really glad it turned out this way. I don't know. He gave it with a smile. But anyway, so the fact of the matter is that some of the Irish Christians actually left, some monks mainly. Obviously, the peasants can't just pack up and leave, but a lot of the monks went back to Ionia, and Iona stayed on that non-Roman practice for quite some time. But by the end of the 7th century, let's say by 700 AD, everybody in the area and all the Isles, Ireland and the British Isles, they were on the Roman practice. And this unifies the Anglo-Saxon church. And I think that's very important. At least they're all they're following the Roman practice, and they are celebrating Easter on the same day.
The Anglo-Saxon church, it's starting to get organized, and now we have a bishop structure with the Archbishop of Canterbury sort of rising to the top. In a later episode, we're going to talk about a really important Archbishop of Canterbury. Can you give us a quick outline of who were some of the important archbishops of Canterbury between the first one, Augustine, and then Theodore, who we're going to talk about?
Sure, no problem. Well, of course, Augustine is going to be the most significant and influential one for a while, at least until Theodore comes along. Augustine had a major job. He had to set up Roman Christianity in England, or at least in Kent. He was given the pallium, the pallium is like a stole that you wear around your shoulders. In the Eastern Church, it's called the omophorion, but it's a symbol of your authority as a bishop. So Gregory sent him a pallium that made him official as a bishop, told him to consecrate 12 more bishops, and Gregory had this great plan. He wanted to divide England ecclesiastically into two parts, the north and the south. York would become an archbishopric. York is in the north, in Northumbria, and it would have 12 bishops under it. But Canterbury would be the supreme bishopric. So you're going to have 24 bishops in summary, but this did not happen for whatever reason. Very few bishops were consecrated. Augustine consecrates only 2 bishops, as far as we know, and a man named Mellitus, who was one of his people that had come with him, originally part of the 40 companions. He was made Bishop of London, and again, London was part of Essex at the time. It was a fairly major city to Essex, but not the huge center of England that it would be later. And he also consecrates another bishop named Justus of Rochester, and Rochester is also in Kent. Gregory told Augustine, this is interesting, Augustine sent letters to Gregory with a lot of questions, and Bede preserves these. You know, he was a Roman, as we mentioned, Augustine was, and he was up among these people with a very different culture, different language, different religious background, and he didn't know what to do in some cases. You know, what do I do when this happens? What do I do when that happens? So there's a dialogue between him and Gregory. He sends letters asking Gregory, what do I do? Gregory sends him the answer, and it's very interesting to read. It tells a lot about what was going on in the English church, or at least the church in Kent at the time. I do want to read a brief excerpt from Bede, if I may. Augustine, another one of his jobs was to establish ecclesiastical control over all of England and Britain, too, including the British areas. We talked about how the British Christians had been pushed back to the fringes. So he actually meets, Augustine goes out to meet these British bishops. Okay, say that 10 times fast. Here's an interesting story. So let me read this, if I will. Meanwhile, with the aid of King Athelbert, Augustine summoned the bishops and teachers of the nearest British province to a conference at a place still known to the English as Augustine's Oak, which lies on the border between the Hwiccas and the West Saxons. The Hwiccas were kind of a mini kingdom that rose and fell a few times. He, that is Augustine, began by urging them, that is the British bishops, to establish brotherly relations with him in Catholic unity and to join with him in God's work of preaching the gospel to the heathen. Now, the Britons did not keep Easter at the correct time. It's kind of funny. I like that Bede is very much in the tank for Rome. But between the 14th and 20th days of the moon, a calculation depending on a cycle of 84 years. Furthermore, certain other of their customs were at variance with the universal practice of the church. But despite protracted discussions, neither the prayers nor the advice nor the censures of Augustine and his companions could obtain the compliance of the Britons, who stubbornly preferred their own customs to those in universal use among Christian churches. Augustine then brought this lengthy and fruitless conference to a close, saying, "Let us ask our Lord, who makes men to be of one mind in his Father's house, to grant us a sign from heaven and show us which tradition is to be followed, by which roads we are to hasten our steps towards his kingdom. Bring in some sick person, and let the beliefs and practice of those who can heal him be accepted as pleasing to God and be followed by all." On the reluctant agreement of his opponents, a blind Englishman was led in and presented to the British priests, from whose ministry he obtained no healing or benefit. Then Augustine, as the occasion demanded, knelt in prayer to the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, imploring that the man's lost sight be restored and prove the means of bringing the light of spiritual grace to the minds of countless believers. Immediately the blind man's sight was restored, and all acknowledged Augustine as the true herald of the light of Christ. The Britons declared that, while they had learned that what Augustine taught was the true way of righteousness, they could not abandon their ancient customs without the consent and approval of their own people, and therefore asked that a second and fuller conference might be held. And I'll just summarize the rest. They do have that second conference, and the British talk among themselves, and they say, how do we know that this Augustine is a true man of God? And somebody says, well, if he's a humble man, then we know he's a true man of God. So if we go in to see him and he stands up to greet us, that will be a sign of his humility, and we will acknowledge him as our head. So they go to see Augustine, and guess what Augustine doesn't do? He doesn't stand up. When these British bishops and other church leaders come into his presence, Augustine stays in his chair, which is kind of the symbol of, I'm the king, I'm the boss. I don't get up for you, right? So they say, well, all right, he's not a humble man, so we're not going to follow him. So it's kind of funny. But it's just delightful to read Bede. Bede is totally of course, on the Roman side, and Bede is saying, well, they had incorrect practices and they were stubborn and they refused to part with their ancient ways. Even though Augustine healed this blind man, that wasn't good enough for these hard-headed British people. It's fun to read stuff. It's just so over the top sometimes. So there's not going to be unity between the British Christians out in the West and the English church for a long, long time yet. All right, let me go on and just briefly talk about some of the other archbishops. Augustine dies in 605, and so he had been on the leader of the Church of England for about 8 years or so. He's replaced by Laurentius, who was probably one of the original missionaries from Rome. Augustine had sent him back to Rome with his letter to Gregory with the questions, and then he brought back the answers, as we mentioned. He came back with Mellitus and the second group of missionaries. He continued Augustine's efforts to bring the British churches fully into the Roman fold, and he had a vision from St. Peter, and Laurentius won King Eadbald to Christianity. Eadbald was Ethelbert's son, or Adbald, I should say. So remember, we said that Ethelbert, his son, originally stayed pagan, but then, so Laurentius is the one that converted him. And then he dies in 619, and we have Mellitus, another one of the missionaries. He had been Bishop of London, but he had been expelled during a pagan resurgence. The only thing we know about him of significance is that he put out a fire solely by his prayers, according to Bede. So that's pretty impressive. Then you have Justus. Justus was commended by Pope Boniface, and it was during his reign that a priest named Paulinus traveled to Northumbria and taught the faith to King Edwin, who accepted it after about 2 years. And he became Archbishop of York. Paulinus did. Justus was from 624 to we don't know. We don't know exactly when his term ended. He was replaced by Honorius, who was from about the late 620s, early 630s to 653. So he lasted a long time. During his archiepiscopate, he consecrated the first native English bishop of Rochester. So we're starting to raise up local leadership. And he helped the missionary efforts of Felix among the East Anglians. He was the last to die among the Gregorian missionaries. And then I want to talk about a couple more real quick. Honorius was succeeded by a man named Deus Dedit. Deus Dedit is an interesting name. It's Latin, and it means God has given. But he wasn't a Roman. He's the first Anglo Saxon to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, and that's very significant. So we've passed from the level of we've got to have all these foreigners leading the church to now we have one of our own. But he wasn't very powerful. By this time, the power of the Archbishop of Canterbury had declined somewhat, and his authority probably didn't extend past his own diocese and maybe Rochester. So he wasn't really acknowledged very much outside of Kent. The Synod of Whitby, which we talked about earlier, which settled the question of do we follow the Roman or Irish practice, that was held during his term, and he probably wasn't present. He appears to have died of a plague in 664. And then a couple of the English kings picked a successor for him named Wighard, and they sent Wighard to Rome to be consecrated. These others had been consecrated by just what other bishop was available at the time. But they decided, let's send him to Rome. So this fellow Wighard, who's going to be the new Archbishop of Canterbury, he goes to Rome, and he dies of the plague. And that puts the English church into a crisis. And that's what we'll talk about next time.
And that is where we're going to leave off today. I want to thank you so much, Professor Early. We've gone through a lot of material today and threw out a lot of information, which I think was really fascinating. If people want to learn more about some of your other pursuits with American history, where can they find you?
Well, the best place is to go on Facebook and search for the group American History Fanatics. We have a really fun group. We do quizzes and contests and polls, but we also just have a lot of people that post really interesting articles, and we talk a lot about movies, and it's just a fun place to be. So American History Fanatics.
Well, thank you very much for listening today, and definitely check out the next episode where we will talk about the next Archbishop of Canterbury, who's going to have a really fascinating tale in and of himself. So I hope you tune in for that. Thank you again for joining us today, Professor Early.
My pleasure, Steve. Always good to talk to you.